Hello and welcome. I'm Professor G, and today I want to discuss a very interesting topic concerning slavery in the antebellum South, and that is how come that jurists and slave owners and the entire slaveocracy, the slave society that was the South, believe that people of African descent, and in some situations people of Native American descent, could be slaves, but that white Caucasian people not only shouldn't be slaves, but could not be enslaved by other white individuals. And this leads back to the whole foundation of the system of African slavery in the antebellum South, which was a race-based hierarchy. And you have to understand that in order to make slavery work, in light of court decisions that came from Great Britain, such as the Somerset decision, which I talked about in a previous lesson, where Lord Mansfield over in England declared that slavery is so odious, that it goes so against human nature, that it could only exist by positive law, meaning that slavery was not the natural state for any human being, so therefore there had to be positive law. A law had to clearly say you can have slaves in order for slavery to exist. Well, in a previous lesson, I explained to you that jurists in the antebellum South, particularly a man named Thomas R. Cobb, who wrote an inquiry into the laws of Negro slavery in the United States, which the book will be referencing today. And again, I say this in every video, but for new viewers, I resort to him a lot in a lot of the scholarly research that I've published. I go to him as a default when you want to understand how slave-holding jurists, how slave-holding attorneys and judges actually looked at the institution of slavery in the antebellum South. And he wasn't just some nobody or just some, petty attorney. He was well respected in the Georgia bar, and he's known as the James Madison of the Confederacy. James Madison being the father of the U.S. Constitution. Thomas Cobb was pretty much known as one of the fathers of the Constitution of the Confederate States of America. So this book was used and cited by courts during the antebellum period in the South dealing with issues of slavery. Well, Thomas Cobb and other jurists in the South obviously didn't accept the Somerset decision, and they believed that slavery was the natural condition for people of African descent and some Native Americans and, of course, people of mixed descent. And they used nature, the law of nature, to justify the existence of slavery. Well, how then did they also twist that to say that the law of nature forbid Caucasian slavery? And this is brought up a lot on this channel, when people talk or people comment and for some reason feel like they need to remind me that other people were enslaved as well. Yes, almost every ethnicity at some point during the corpus of human history has been enslaved. But the enslavement of one race doesn't take away from the importance of learning the history of the enslavement of another. And the United States, our original sin is the institution of African slavery. And the antebellum South existed, I contend, as almost an entirely different nation. It was a slaveocracy. It was a slave society. It wasn't a society that had slaves. It was a society that based itself entirely around this institution of slavery. So it's important to look at what these jurists and lawmakers and judges and courts and all of these people believe to be the foundations for slavery in the antebellum South, because this racist hierarchy, this racist view of people of African descent didn't simply end with the passage of the 13th Amendment and the end of the Civil War. So that's what I wanted to point to today. So how did Cobb and these other jurists in the South come up with this argument that it was okay to enslave one race of people, but not another? Well, Cobb points to the law of nature. And he actually writes that the law of nature as defined by him, or what he believes the definition to be, he adopted as the law of nature when applied to man in his intercourse with fellow man. So the law of nature to Cobb, when one group of people is dealing with another, that that obligation which reason and conscience impose, so as to shape his intercourse as to attain the greatest happiness and arrive at the greatest perfection of which his nature is susceptible. Consequently, whatever interferes with the attainment of that happiness and perfection does violence to the law of his nature, and whatever promotes or is consistent therewithin is sanctioned by the law of nature. So what he's saying is, if I, as one group of people, do something to you, if that benefits you, if that makes you better because of it, then my action to you does not violate the law of nature. However, if what I do to you causes you to digress, causes you harm in some way, then that does go against the law of nature. And that causing harm is where it's going to get a little squirrely, because really what he's saying is kind of like when you were growing up and your parents might threaten to spank you and say this is going to hurt you more than it's going to hurt me. They would actually cause harm to you, but the greater benefit was considered, the reason for that. That's kind of also what he gets into with slavery here, but we'll discuss that. He says, in this view, natural rights, such as freedom, right, depend entirely upon the nature of the possessor, not of the right, for it is the former and not the latter that determines the question of right. Hence, to speak of the natural right to personal liberty is unphilosophical, until the previous question is settled that such liberty will conduce to the happiness and perfection of the professor. So what he's saying is, you can't say that natural freedom or liberty, the freedom or liberty is a natural right of a person or a group of people or a race, unless you can prove that liberty and freedom benefits that race. If it doesn't benefit that race, then it is not a natural right for them, and therefore it doesn't violate the law of nature to take that from them. Do you see where this is going? Right? As I've said in previous lessons, if Cobb can prove that enslaving people of African descent makes them better, then they never possess the right to liberty or freedom, because that doesn't do anything for their nature. It doesn't do anything to make them better. It's not their natural condition, whereas liberty and freedom is, according to Cobb, the natural condition of the white race. Now he goes on to explain, he continues to talk about this. In this view, is Negro slavery consistent with the law of nature? We confine the inquiry to Negro slavery because, upon the principles already established, this idea of law of nature and what you can do to another person or another group of people, upon the principles already established, it is undoubtedly true that the enslavement by one man or one race of another man or another race, physically, intellectually, and morally their equals, is contrary to the law of nature, because it promotes not their happiness and tends not to their perfection. So what he's saying is that because white people are equal in intellectual capacity and liberty and freedom, if I enslave another white person, I'm not bettering their condition. So therefore, it goes against the law of nature for me to enslave someone of my same race. It doesn't better them, it actually harms them or keeps them at a level where they can never progress or attain that perfection. So do you see Cobb's kind of convoluted method to come up with an answer for why white people should not be slaves, at least to other white people, because it does nothing to better their condition, right? So he then goes on and almost 50, 60, 70 pages later, going through to explain the physical inferiority, the mental inferiority, all the different the ways in which people of African descent are inferior, and how slavery betters them for it. And since it betters them, then clearly it is their natural condition and it doesn't violate the law of nature, whereas enslaving a white person under the same circumstances would not benefit them. It would not create a better white person. That's why this entire thing is racially based, as a racial hierarchy, is absolutely disturbing. He says, the inquiry into the physical, mental, and moral development of the Negro race seems to point them clearly as particularly fitted for a laborious class. Their physical frame is capable of great and long-continued exertion. Their mental capacity renders them incapable of successful self-development, and yet adapts them for the direction of a wiser race. Their moral character renders them happy, peaceful, contented, and cheerful in a status that would break the spirit and destroy the energies of the Caucasian or the Native American. So you see what he did there? When enslaved, people of African descent do better. They're happier. They're more conducive to physical labor. Whereas if you enslave a white person or a Native American, now, by the way, there many states in the antebellum South, from the early Republic all the way up to the beginning of the Civil War and the end of the Confederacy, did actually have provisions for the enslavement of Native Americans, but historically, enslaving Native Americans always, when the Spanish came originally and used Native Americans for slaves, disease and the pretty much the decimation of the indigenous population made it not a viable source for enslaved individuals. So it kind of just fizzled out. And Caucasians, for the most part, white people of European descent, and eventually Americans, stopped looking to Native Americans as a source for slaves. But there were certain laws on books in states that did allow for certain situations of Native Americans to be enslaved. So that's important to note. But as you can tell, and historically going through the development of the antebellum South, all that really peters off and it simply becomes African slavery. But he points to the fact that obviously, clearly, they knew this. They knew that enslaving Native Americans didn't work, and he points to that as well because that goes against their nature and it didn't benefit them. So therefore, the enslavement of Native Americans goes against the law of nature, same as Caucasians, because it would break and destroy the energies of the Caucasian and the Native American. He then goes on to do something even more disturbing, but this happens a lot. He said, nature has so constituted the animal creation that when any portion of it is placed in a position doing violence to the law of their nature, it dwindles and becomes extinct. Thus, domestication is destruction to many animals, while it perfects the development of the horse, the cow, and others. So bondage has ever proven annihilation to the American Indian, whether under the Spanish Hidalgo, or the New England Puritan, or the Virginia Cavalier. What has been the effect in this respect upon the Negro? The answer to this question is the voice of nature, whether her law is violated in his enslavement. So what he goes on to then say, and I won't belabor this point for too much longer, is that when you domesticate certain animals, they do well in domestication. When you try and domesticate others, they die off. They can't be domesticated. And then he uses that as an analogy to the Native Americans trying to be enslaved. That enslavement actually caused them to become almost extinct. And then he says, well, if we look at the African people here in the United States who are enslaved, if their population has gone up, right, if they have increased, then clearly slavery doesn't go against their nature because they're thriving within slavery. And that's what he goes on to do, or attempt to do, is that because the population of enslaved people has been growing, clearly they are thriving under domestication, just as animals thrive under, certain animals can thrive under domestication. And the animals that can't, we don't domesticate. So therefore, the people that can't thrive under slavery, we don't enslave. But the people that do thrive in slavery, in this case, he said people of African descent, we do enslave. So that's what I wanted to point out today, is to make this real quick lesson. I say quick, it's already 13 minutes. And if you last as long, I appreciate it, because it is very important to study this stuff. Like I said, this didn't just go away with the 13th Amendment, with the end of the Civil War. This racial hierarchy of the South, where all white people, and go watch my last video where I said, yes, not all white people owned slaves, but all white people benefited from the slaveocracy, from the slave society that was the antebellum South, and they were all wound up in it in some way. So they didn't want that to simply end when slavery ended. And the attempt to continue to keep this system, this race-based system intact after the Civil War is what led to Jim Crow laws, the entire civil rights era, and even to today, where you have systemic racism embedded within the legal system in the United States, because this system was created, and especially in the South, from the early Republic up to the Civil War, to create a system, a racially based system of white superiority and white dominance over people of African descent and Native Americans as well. So it's important to continue to study that. And to show you how these jurists played legal gymnastics with the law and with their understanding of it, to say how it's okay to enslave people of African descent, and in some cases Native Americans, but predominantly people of African descent, while it is not okay to enslave white people, they went to great lengths to do that, to show you that they believed it was within the law of nature for whites to enslave blacks, but whites could not enslave other whites because that goes against the law of nature. And no other race should be able to enslave whites because whites are, of course, according to them, the superior race and above all others. So, again, it's difficult to listen to this. It's difficult to study, but it's very important that we study this and continue to study this, and we don't forget the legal foundations of the slaveocracy of the antebellum South. So until next time.